Ramanuja, Myth and Reality. Chapter 4, Koil Olugu. A chronicle in Tamil called Koil Olugu, that is, temple chronicle relating to the Sri Rangam temple, is of great importance to the study of the life of Ramanuja and his administrative reforms. Sri V. N. Hari Rao has published a complete translation in English of this text in the year 1961. Quoted as, "It seemed to be a register maintained by the accountant of the storehouse of the Sri Rangam temple of the events and happenings recorded then and there in his own handwriting in the presence of 4 persons. This was kept sealed and was referred to whenever there was a dispute." End quote. There was an opinion that it was completed in the 18th century, but Hari Rao felt that the origin of this chronicle should be traced to the time of Sri Ramanuja, as he is given the most exhaustive treatment here. The Olugu itself states that it was written by Purvacharya, the head preachers of the past. It is evident that it is a chronicle of the Ramanuja tradition with emphasis on Ramanuja. Hari Rao also observes that it is not impossible that in the past an original and an early Kadgan existed in the Sri Rangam temple before Orison and Mohammedan invasion in the medieval period. Obviously, what has come down is not the original account that shows why the sequence of events is jumbled. Example, the period of the Acharyas is dealt with after the first Mohammedan invasion on Sri Rangam. In this connection, the following notes of Hari Rao are valuable. They show when the present Olugu was written. Quoted as, "In the year 1801 AD, the Carnatic passed under the control of the English East India Company, and a collector John Wallace by name was sent to take charge of the Tiruchinapolli district in August of that year. The Koir Olugu and the section dealing with it ends with the statement, start quote, that temple was Tenkalai and not Vadakalai, end quote. This is the account of affairs of the temple up to the month of Aipasi of Saka 1725. Rudrotkari. Velappa Mudaliyar brought to the notice of John Wallace all the Olugus in the town, and at the desire of the latter had the Olugu rewritten along with the events up to the days of Wallace, and placed a copy of the same bearing the seal of the Sthanattar in the Terkil Kallari, that is, southern storeroom of the temple. It is clear that it is a work of 19th century. All the exhaustive accounts of temple administration given in the work as organized by Ramanuja were prevalent in the beginning of the 19th century and are said to have been recorded by the Purvacharya. End quotes. The bias towards Tenkalai school found in these records cannot be considered as absolute history. It should not be forgotten that this is probably based mainly on the information provided by the Sri Ranganarayana Jiyar Mata in the Sri Rangam temple, where traditionally Ramanuja is said to have lived, and which belongs to the Tenkalai tradition. As such, this record does not reflect the events and procedures found in the actual recorded inscriptions found in the temple. When the British took over the administration around 1800, they started collecting and compiling written documents to decide on the claims and counterclaims for ownership and authority. In most cases, we find the records are in a stereotyped language and contain the bias of the compiler and his advisors. The British collected statements from influential socialites too and had them registered and preserved them for their verification. We may cite another example of the collector of Jinji region ordering the compilation of a similar history that resulted in the Karnataka Rajakal Savistara Charitam mentioned earlier. The accounts collected by Mackenzie on the history of Palaya Padukkalin Vamsavali is also a similar attempt that resulted in a compilation of Puranas and hearsay accounts and not history. However, some traditions recorded in the text are also corroborated by inscriptions. For example, the Olugu mentions the tradition of depositing a document in the stores of the temple. A Chola inscription in the Sri Rangam temple dated in the reign of Kulothunga III, dated 1209, relating to a land deed, well drafted, records, quote, "This document must be deposited in the storeroom. பந்தாரத்து ஒதுக்கிலே கண்டருள பெறவென்று விண்ணப்பம் செய்ய, as requested by one துவரை பெருமாள்." The approval of the Lord was obtained and the final order was engraved on stone. The necessity to maintain the approved records was felt keenly in the Chola period, and some such records continue to exist in some matas and temples. One has to evaluate the evidence found in the inscriptions to arrive at real history. Sri Rangam takeover. Carmen, in his book on Ramanuja, gives the following account of how Ramanuja took over the administration of the Sri Rangam temple. Start quote, "The Koyil Olugu gives another story not found in the biographies, however, which illumines the conflict behind the transfer of power. Even after Ramanuja had been welcomed and given certain powers, the keys to temple remained in the hands of the hereditary high priest, Periya Nambi, and this high priest opposed Ramanuja's plan to change from a 5-fold to a 10-fold division of the temple servants, Parijanas. Ramanuja thought of removing him, that is, the oral tradition of the high priest family claims Ramanuja thought of poisoning him. But Lord Ranga appeared to Ramanuja in a dream and pointed out that, quote, "For a long time past, Periya Nambi has entrusted himself to our care. You can do as you please." End quote. When Ramanuja woke up, he called his disciple Kurattarvan and reported his dream. "The existence of my enemy, as it seems to be agreeable to the Lord. Let us go to Perumal Koil in Kanchipuram." Kurattarvan is said to have persuaded his master that the Lord would help to make the high priest his disciple. Quote, "If so, you bring him around." End quote, said Ramanuja. The Koyil Olugu simply reports that Kurattarvan succeeded in persuading the learned high priest to seek Ramanuja as his guru, and gives after the story of Kurattarvan participating in the funeral ceremonies for Periya Nambi's mother, at the conclusion of which Periya Nambi gives to Kurattarvan as the official guest at the 11th day feast, quote, "The hereditary office of the high priest and the right to read the Puranas in the temple and so on, also the document registering these gifts." Kurattarvan immediately turned over these gifts to Ramanuja. End quote. The oral tradition handed down by the descendants of Periya Nambi gives a rather different version of the events, one that suggests that Kurattarvan tricked their ancestor out of his inherited status as high priest. According to this version, Kurattarvan ingratiated himself with the mother of Periya Nambi by first singing and later explaining the hymns of the Arvars to her. Her son is said to have been a Vedic scholar but not well versed in Tamil hymns. It was on this account that Kurattarvan received an invitation to be one of the Brahmin guests at the 11th day feast. When asked again, he replied that all he still wanted were the keys to the temple. The demands of hospitality forced Periya Nambi to agree. He turned over not only his keys but his house to Kurattarvan and left immediately for his country home, where he completed the remaining rites for his mother. When Ramanuja and Kurattarvan tried to enter the temple the next morning, the priest stopped him. They were allowed to proceed only when Periya Nambi came back and confirmed that he had indeed turned over all his perquisites to Ramanuja's lieutenant. End quote. I do not think it speaks high of Ramanuja to take over the key of the temple in this manner, even against the wishes of Lord Ranganatha. These are good illustrations of concocted stories on Ramanuja whose greatness is pulled down to question. The takeover of the temple administration requires the approval of then ruling Chola king, under whose direct control the temple was functioning, and the symbolic approval of the Lord. Further, it would have been inscribed on the temple walls, as seen in hundreds of records in Sri Rangam temple. The biographical tradition on personality and even on specific teachings of Ramanuja following remarks by Carmen deserves notice. Doubtless, the specific words attributed to Ramanuja after a century or more after oral transmission are so highly colored by later views of what Ramanuja ought to have said that they tell us little on what he actually taught. Victory in debate. About the story of conversion of Yajnamurti, an Advaita exponent, Carmen's remarks are equally interesting. Quoted, Yajnamurti is said to have challenged Ramanuja to a debate and Ramanuja agreed and 18 days duration was fixed for the debate. For the first 16 days neither gained advantage, but on the 17th day Ramanuja could make no headway against Yajnamurti's logic and went home very discouraged. He then prayed for help of household deity Lord Varada, who answered his prayer by appearing that night in a dream. Next day, Yajnamurti was inspired about Ramanuja's confidence, admitted defeat even before the debate began. The most striking question to me, however, is why Ramanuja's followers would have remembered and retold the story in a form that seems to reflect so little credit to Ramanuja's skill as a debater. It seems that the emphasis on the biographical tradition is not so on the fine points of metaphysics. There seems at times to be a certain anti-intellectual bias, and certainly there is an emphasis on all occasion of divine intervention. End quote. Regarding the conversion of Hoysala king Bhitika Vishnuvardhana from Jainism to Vaishnavism, Carmen remarks, quote, most of the kings of that era were not religious fanatics. Their personal religious preferences did not prevent them from supporting religious institutions of Shaivas, Vaishnavas, and often Buddhists and Jains. Since Vishnuvardhana seems to have had this name Vishnuvardhanan from the beginning of his reign, it is not clear his favors to Ramanuja could be considered as conversion, nor do we have a withdrawal of support to the Jains. End quote. These citations from a serious and unbiased scholar are examples of the difficulty faced by those working on Ramanuja's biography and cluster of stories built around him.